So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my work around scholarly podcasting, and particularly about the Amplify podcast network, which is my primary research topic right now. And I'm going to start, let's find out, is this moving? Yeah, there we go. So here's where things started. In 2015, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alberta in the English department, where things were looking pretty dicey for the prospects of getting a job. And so I decided, instead of making smart career decisions, I would start a very silly podcast about Harry Potter with one of my best friends. We sat down one day, we drank a bottle of wine. We started writing a script, we drank another bottle of wine, we recorded the first episode, and what turned out to really kind of blow our minds about Witch Please was the fact that we grew an audience that wasn't 100% other humanities graduate students. In fact, it turned out that there was a significant appetite out there for publicly accessible and engaging conversations about scholarship. So, fast forward to starting my position here at SFU in the publishing program, I started a collaboration with Siobhan McMenemy, who is the editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And we were interested in whether or not we could take this sort of inkling that I had from Witch Please, that there might be an appetite for scholarly podcasts out there, and actually turn podcasting into a form of scholarly communication. So we got a SSHRC grant, and I started making Secret Feminist Agenda, which I very foolishly decided to make a weekly podcast. Bad idea, don't do it. We made 4 seasons of Secret Feminist Agenda, and we peer-reviewed the first 3 seasons of it using an open peer review process that was developed by Siobhan out of her experience with publishing scholarly books. And what we found was that our hypothesis that podcasts are a pretty effective way to make publicly engaged scholarship that will gather a wider audience outside of academia into a conversation was true. That was accurate. We built a significant listenership. We had a lot of engagement. The peer review went really well. And so, as a publishing scholar, my next question was, cool, it's neat that I can do this by myself. What's the infrastructure that is necessary to make it possible for other people to also do this? And that is where the Amplify Podcast Network came from. So this is a project with a lot of different pieces, and I'm not going to talk about all of them because some of them are really fun to me, but maybe boring to everybody here. Hands up if you love metadata. Oh my God, look at all you nerds. I love this. Okay, we're just going to talk. We can talk about metadata during the 15-minute break. But the point of the Amplify Podcast Network is to develop actual methods, like reusable processes through which you can produce, peer review, publish, and preserve, that wasn't supposed to be alliterative, scholarly podcasts. So we've got a slate of our first season of podcasters. Brenna Clark-Gray, who is an educational technology scholar at Thompson Rivers University, is making a podcast about post-secondary pedagogy. Kendra Cowley and Maria Alvarez-Malvito, who are master's students in information studies at the University of Alberta, are making a podcast about border crossing and radical activism on the part of knowledge workers, including librarians. And Daniel Heath Justice, who is in Indigenous Studies at UBC, is making a podcast about our complex relationships with other than human kin. The first episode is going to be about coyotes. I'm really excited. So I could talk to you a lot more about what we're doing with Amplify, but what I actually want to do with the second piece of this is talk a little bit about why it is that I actually think podcasting is such a good fit for this kind of publicly engaged scholarship. So here's my first, edgiest claim. Podcasting represents the promise of the web we lost. The phrase "the web we lost" comes from Anil Dash. He's a technologist. And what he's referring to is the early promise of Web 2.0, when it was being understood as a lateral, non-hierarchical web. You know, that's why we called it that, because we thought it could be like a web, that was particularly driven by a technological innovation known as RSS, or really simple syndication. The cool thing about RSS is that it's subscription-based and that it is opt in, and that the culture of RSS, which anybody here who can remember blogs will recall, is a fairly lateral one, right? That it's not over here are the creators and over here are the consumers. It's very much embedded in that sort of prosumer identity. You read a blog, you make a blog, you comment on other people's blogs, and podcasting continues to be the same kind of medium. It's RSS feed based, it's not driven by algorithms, it's not owned by a particular platform, it's not owned by Apple Podcasts, it's distributed by a lot of different platforms, and anyone can start a podcast. The barrier to access is remarkably low. We hear a lot of sneering jokes about that, a lot of people rolling their eyes and saying everybody and their dog has a podcast, but we all, as critical thinkers, know to be suspicious of that, and maybe to notice that right around the moment when people say that a medium has become saturated and exhausted is also exactly the same moment when women and people of color gain access to that medium. Maybe see that that's a historical trend. Anyway, the whole thing about podcasting being RSS feed driven means that there is still space for this medium to be fairly DIY and even potentially a little bit radical, because people don't need access to significant amounts of industry money or backing to build a micro public around a podcast. You need industry backing and money to build a massive public, but podcasting doesn't need massive publics. It follows all of the logics of digital publishing, which is to say, you get a small group of people who are deeply engaged, and you can build something that is quite sustainable. The other really cool thing about podcasting is the particular way we listen to podcasts. So podcasts tend to be listened to not, like radio shows of old where you put it on and people gather around, but rather we put headphones in and we listen while we're doing other things. And a lot of scholars have pointed out that what that creates is a feeling where you feel a sort of sense of heightened intimacy with the stranger who is your favorite podcast host. And what goes hand in hand with that listening mode and that sense of intimacy is a willingness to follow podcasters through remarkably long episodes. There's a lot of people talking these days about the tendency for people who read digitally to skim. Right? If you're publishing something online, it's like, well, it has to have graphs and bullet points because nobody's going to read anything other than the first 3 lines. People listen to 3-hour podcasts. People listen to 8-hour podcasts. It's absolutely wild. And they listen to a lot of educational podcasts. They are willing to follow their podcasters on relatively complex topics, which makes it kind of a really ideal medium for academics who are interested in having publicly engaged conversations, but don't necessarily want to hyper-simplify what they're doing. So that's my real tiny nutshell pitch for podcasting, but I recognize that there are some significant barriers, and particularly through the process of developing the Amplify podcast network, we've really come up against those barriers. One, right at the forefront, is time. It is very hard to get academics to do different things than they're already doing because everybody is very tired and doesn't have any time. Barrier 1. Barrier 2, skills. Lots of folks might be interested in the idea of making a podcast but don't know how to produce audio. And barrier 3 is credit, that in an increasingly precaritized and neoliberalized post-secondary system, we're really wary about doing anything that's not going to count on our CVs. So we've been trying to tackle these challenges one by one. We have developed an open access guide to academic podcasting that lays out all of the key skills that are necessary to take somebody from total beginner to being ready to make their first show. We developed a peer review system through the press that we ran through the pilot version with Secret Feminist Agenda. Now we're going to do another round with our next 3 podcasts. We're figuring out best practices so that your podcast can be peer reviewed and legitimized and go on your CV and really count as scholarship. I can talk more about the actual process if you're curious. But the barrier that we have come to at this stage in the project is the barrier of time. I mean, bless our podcasters, trying to get audio out of them is like getting blood from a stone. Like it's really hard. And so that's kind of where we're at right now, is sort of asking questions about how we overcome this next barrier that we've encountered. And there's a few ways of thinking about it. We've been talking about starting a podcasting boot camp. I really like the idea of locking people in a building for a week and just making them record things. We've been talking about rolling in podcast funding and payment for audio producers into, say, your next SSHRC grant, so that you can actually pay somebody with audio production expertise to help you make your thing. And then we've also been talking about, prioritizing community engagement over metric-based approaches to scholarly production, so that we don't all have to, publish 1,000 things a year in a desperate bid to keep our jobs. But I'm out of time. So that's the Amplify Podcast Network. Any questions?